20th April 2024, time is coming up for 1300. This will be voice note number one as I begin the role of social media before, during, and after a disaster on behalf of Disaster Relief CERT, CERT being the acronym for Community Emergency Response Teams. As this is the first voice note that will be conducted, I'd just like to explain the process by which I will be conducting this discussion. Moving forward, I will do voice note segments of approximately 5 minutes each. This will allow you to be able to listen to the voice notes in your own time, especially if you are driving and moving between two locations. It's an ideal opportunity, just instead of listening to LM Radio or Capital Radio or one of the other local radio stations, you could always just tune up on your voice note and follow the conversation as I work at moving forward. On that basis, I will then start off by just introducing myself and our organization, namely Disaster Relief CERT. My name is Chad Milam. I'm one of three of the incorporating founding members of Disaster Relief CERT. The other two founding incorporators is John Groom and Stephen Reynolds, and the three of us form our board of directors. And it is up to us to ensure that we, in actual fact, do comply with, firstly, certain legislation. But in terms of our own memorandum of incorporation, our prime and sole object is to prepare volunteers to be able to assist in times of disaster. Our auxiliary or ancillary objectives, of course, are to recruit volunteers, to assist in the training of volunteers, and to create awareness or raise awareness amongst local communities with regards to the potential risk of disasters occurring within our local communities. Disaster Relief CERT is a registered CIPC, or at least registered with CIPC as a non-profit company, and we are also a SARS-approved public benefit organization. This does not make us an NPO. An NPO is an association or organization which is registered with the Department of Social Development, and that's a totally separate category altogether. However, as a non-government organization, we are considered a not-for-profit organization. What that means is that any donations, sponsors, finances, etc., that the non-profit company would acquire during its time of operation, those monies are in actual fact not dispersed for the benefit of the directors under any circumstances, just nilly-willy in terms of the Companies Act, etc. Although the directors, very much like any other staff members of the non-profit company being the key word, are entitled to receive fair remuneration for services rendered or whatever the case might be. In other words, when we have sufficient donations and when we employ full-time staff from the monies that the NPC can acquire through donations or through sponsorships, then of course salaries can be paid out of those monies, in addition to utilizing funds for specific relief operations. On that basis, I do wish to point out that we are not a first responder organization. It is not our plan, our purpose, or our intent to be running motor vehicle accidents and single structural collapses or attending fires or any other sort of incident one would expect our local emergency management services, that being fire brigade services, ambulance services, Metro Police Department, SAPS, etc., as they would run it on a day-to-day basis. That is not our prime concern under any circumstances. Our plan is to prepare volunteers to be able to assist in terms of large-scale events or at times of disasters, natural or man-made, such as earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, etc. Right, let's move on to voice note number 2, as I've just gone over the first 5-minute mark. All right, now, the one thing that I would like to point out is that during the course of creating these voice notes, I am also producing a video which will only be released at a much later time period, as I might, provide some back-end editing. I could possibly bring in additional information on screen specifically for those that did not manage to get the voice notes, or where voice notes are damaged or whatever. So it's purely a backup in this aspect. However, I'd like to ask you not to rely on the video, because that could take a bit of time, and in the interim, you could in actual fact follow the entire discussion. So just to reiterate, Disaster Relief CERT is not a first responder organization. It is not our plan, our intent to actually deal with these matters. However, our registered volunteers in their own personal capacity are always free to participate in other non-government organizations, other volunteer associations or entities, and of course carry on their activities during whatever deployment or dispatching is required on a day-to-day basis. However, they would not be doing it, primarily they would not be doing it under the auspices of Disaster Relief CERT. In terms of our own internal policies, if they do require permission from one of the directors, i.e. myself, John Groom, or Stephen Reynolds. Now, as far as personal qualifications are concerned, myself and John Groom were employed with the South African Red Cross Society in the late 80s, early 90s. In total, on the full-time aspect, between us, we have over 10 years full-time experience combined. However, we were both volunteers as well with the South African Red Cross Southern Transvaal region. And I think our combined volunteer years is in excess of 40 years between the two of us. I'm not leaving Stephen Reynolds out. Stephen Reynolds, along with John Groom and myself, have all been involved in the two-way radio communication aspects of life. We are also no, I shouldn't say full-time, but we are fully licensed ICASA radio amateurs. And I think between the three of us, our full-time amateur radio is also somewhere combined in excess of about 40 years. Give or take 30 to 40 years combined experience in terms of amateur radio. In addition to that, in my personal capacity, I'm also the director of MCOM Pty Limited. MCOM Pty Limited is an emergency communications two-way radio supplier and solution provider, specifically providing community emergency radio network capabilities, whereby our communities are able to, or at least will be able to, communicate with each other when they subscribe to the monthly or annual services. And the whole purpose of that is to ensure that we do have radio communication capabilities in times of disasters, or following a disaster, or even in the current situation whereby we may be subjected to extended power outages, power failures, etc., and we are not able to actually call for assistance, as in many instances, internet connection dies. So does the cell phone networks, and therefore you can't just pick up a phone and call for an ambulance. So there's a final layer of emergency communications. In addition to that, additional qualifications, John Groom and myself also attained the level of Emergency Medical Assistant 1 in the late 80s. And of course, the only other provincial qualifications at that time was BA, or Basic Ambulance. And we were actually authorized to provide a little bit more than the BA. However, we were not at the AMA level, which was the first, shall we call it, paramedical qualification before it was renamed AEA or ambulance emergency assistant. So John and myself, during our tenure as full-time staff and volunteers, we spent a lot of time on ambulances and rescues and all the rest of it. And it is on this basis that we decided to bring jointly with Stephen our skill sets together. Stephen also very capable within the IT community and along with John and myself. And therefore, we hope to bring a fair bit of expertise to our actual disaster relief CERT organization as a whole. All right, I'll round up on the qualifications on voice note number 3 as I've just gone over the 5.5 minute mark. Let's move on to voice note number 3. This is voice note number 3, where I'm busy discussing the role of social media before, during, and after a disaster. The first 2 voice notes were an introduction as to who disaster relief CERT is, what disaster relief CERT is not, and then just briefly covering the qualifications with regards to John, Stephen, and myself as being the 3 founding incorporators and directors of the NGO. In addition to that, I did return to Red Cross at one point as the operations manager for Southern Transvaal region, and that is specifically where I received very categoric, detailed, and intense training in disaster relief and assistance in particular, and the management thereof. This training was in actual fact provided by members of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And due to our overall involvement right across the board, we felt it was best to, in actual fact, bring about a non-government organization where we could draw upon volunteers with the specific intent of allowing volunteers to group together within local communities. So, say, for example, within a particular suburb, and to have a minimum of 10 volunteers within that suburb. Now, taking into account that the suburbs might have residents of 30,000, whereas other smaller suburbs might only have 5,000, it doesn't make sense to have, for example, 10 volunteers for 30,000 and an additional 10,000 10 volunteers for 4,000 volunteers. So in the larger suburbs of 30,000, ultimately we do need a lot more volunteers. And the concept is that within each of these suburbs, if and when, and it shouldn't be if, because disasters can occur at any time. When a disaster occurs within the local community, the registered volunteers within that community will be able to follow in a safety first principle and protocol, ensuring their safety, their family are safe, etc. They then can proceed out and undertake initial disaster area damage assessments, take all that information and feed it up through the various channels that we would put in place, and allow that information to flow through to the Disaster Management Center. And all of this will, of course, be done in accordance with the Disaster Management Act. And on that basis, the 4th voice note, I'm just going to quickly cover the various types of volunteers. So I'm not going to do a full 5 minutes on this particular voice note, just so that we can pick it up on the next one. And the reason that I need to cover this is because without this background and without this base understanding, when we specifically look at that role of social media before, during, and after a disaster, if the listeners are not in full understanding, they're not going to be able to follow when we refer to what happens on the volunteer side versus members of the public side. So let's move on with voice note number 4. Now, moving on with voice note number 4, I wanted to, in terms of the Disaster Management Act, I wanted to point out the 3 different levels of volunteers that one can find as defined within the Disaster Management Act itself. The first one is a unit of volunteers. These are members of the public who join a particular disaster management center or municipal disaster management structure or provincial or national structure. They then form part of what's called a unit of volunteers and report directly to the disaster management structure itself and hierarchy. The second level is what's termed general volunteers. Now, general volunteers are volunteers that are drawn in when required, or who step forward to provide assistance in terms of their organization themselves. So whether that be an association, whether that be another non-government organization, a non-profit organization, a public benefit organization, or even a local business, for example. These are the people that don't report directly to disaster management on a day-to-day basis, but they will in actual fact report to and be under the control and make themselves available to the local disaster management center at the time of that particular disaster. Once everything is settled and the disaster has been finalized, even though there might be a restructuring process take place, many of those general volunteers will just continue with their normal activities in whatever manner. So non-government organizations such as the SA Red Cross Society, Disaster Relief CERT, Give to the Givers, Canine Search and Rescue ZA, for example, are all termed general volunteers, even though they can also register as a unit of volunteers, in which case several of them do. Then your local municipal services, your fire, your ambulance, your urban search and rescue, etc., they form part of the emergency management services, which are already associated and linked to the disaster management service, however, or disaster management center. However, they do not form part of the unit of volunteers per se, nor do they form part of the general volunteer structure. Now, the final volunteer category, as per the DMA, or the Disaster Management Act, up front, I want to tell you, these are the most dangerous volunteers you can get. They are called spontaneous volunteers. And these are the members of the general public who, out of the goodness of their heart, step forward to assist, which is fantastic. However, herein lies the problem. They have no training, they have no understanding, and they find it very difficult generally to follow commands or instructions that will be coming through, for example, the EMS structures, etc., etc. And as a result of all of this, they actually hamper, hinder, prevent the disaster relief cycle from flowing in a coordinated and well-disciplined manner. And on that note, those that are listening, don't be despondent. My recommendation, rather join a voluntary organization. Get trained, understand the structure, and better still, understand what not to do. It's not always about what to do, but ultimately what not to do. Okay, let's move on with voice note number 5. With voice note number 5, now this is where the rubber meets the road, because we in actual fact start looking at the whole concept of the role of social media during, before, during, and after a disaster. And I think initially, to start this off, I've got no idea how many voice notes we will in actual fact be using to cover the topic, because it's actually quite an extensive topic overall. And there's certain areas and aspects that I feel that need to be covered. And there's one particular section which will tie up with what I said about spontaneous volunteers in voice note number 4. But up front, I'd like to stipulate that the definition ultimately of social media is things like websites, apps, etc., that enable users to create or share content or to participate in a social networking structure or format. And of course, these social media platforms are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, etc. And they're great in certain times. And before we even start, as I said, we are going to be looking at before, during, and after. So if we look at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube before a disaster, they are all reasonably good platforms in order to raise awareness, possibly even train people, to bring about education in some format or another, to hold discussions, etc. And why do I say generally? Well, Facebook, for example, according to the UNHCR and the ICRC's documentation, and that's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross. In many of their documents where they discuss social media and the integration of social media, it is, on average, it is considered that only 5% of one's followers on Facebook actually see the posts, let alone read the posts. So there might only be 1% of your organization's followers that will in actual fact follow those messages. And personally speaking, is it worth it then? In other words, take this presentation on the role of social media before, during, and after a disaster. On 1,000 volunteers, if 10 volunteers are going to watch this, or 10,000 followers are going to watch this, my question is it really worthwhile to do it on Facebook? What is the benefit of me spending maybe an hour or two on a presentation for only 10 people to follow the conversation itself? Whereas when you look at Twitter, now, of course, Twitter is considered a public-facing entity. So one doesn't always know just how many people your content will reach. I know that certain times it will come up and say viewed by, etc., etc. The problem with Twitter is it takes a very long time to build a following on Twitter. So in order to reach out to the masses, it's going to take several years, perhaps, before you can reach out just your local community. To give you an example, even using WhatsApp, for example, I'm based in Constantia Kloof. We have 4,500 people or residents in Constantia Kloof. Yet our Constantia Kloof and surrounds WhatsApp group probably has in the region of about 700 residents only out of 4,500. And that has taken 14 months to get us to that 700 mark. And if Twitter is going to take even longer, I mean, in the same time period, our Twitter account, for example, may very well only be reaching 50. So is it worthwhile? And I think that's the question everybody needs to consider when we are looking at social media for the dissemination of disaster relief and related content. All right, let's move on to voice note number 6 now. Moving on with voice note number 6 on the social media, the role of social media before, during, and after a disaster. When we start looking at Instagram, that's another one that's going to become a little bit of a problem to build a content, a following, etc., etc. Instagram, of course, is probably far more based on a visual aspect, so therefore a lot of photographs, etc., etc. And for an organization dealing with disaster relief and assistance, or even disaster risk reduction, it does become a little bit difficult to have current information or current photographs, for argument's sake, or videos regarding your specific area, because disasters are not something that occur on a daily basis. So again, that's going to take a bit of time to, in actual fact, grow your following. Then the better option is probably to make use of the YouTube channels. But even there, the YouTube channels, it takes a long time for people to actually subscribe to the channel. To give you an example, in some of the previous discussions that I've done, I've had 10 on one, for example, on international humanitarian law. 10 people would have watched it. Whereas on earthquakes, maybe 50 people would have watched it. And then if the videos are going on, part 1, 2, 3, 4 of like half an hour of video, then people either don't come back and finish the last video. They think they've received enough, or alternatively, again, because it's just a general conversation from my perspective, they get to the point of number 4 and think, well, yeah, all right, we've got it all. We don't need to go any further. Now, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot and say I'm putting everybody to sleep, but I do believe that at some point people are getting the gist of what is being said. And I must state that in terms of some of the groups that I've been working with over the last year in particular, at first things were very difficult. There was a lot of resentment. There was a lot of pushback, and there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation that would in actual fact be shared on, for example, the WhatsApp posts. And after a year, that has settled down, and it's actually now become a far more beneficial debate with regards to the overall raising of awareness, creating of awareness. And people are starting to realize that we need to hold this conversation and determine, okay, what can we do? What can't we do? What should we do? How should we do it? And people are talking about it. The good thing is that even during water outages, more and more people are prepared for it. More and more WhatsApp group members are prepared for the outages. Referring back to the Constantia Kloof and Surrounds group, for example, we have an unexpected power outage. We've just been through 132 hours 10 days ago. And in total, over the 32-hour period, if we had 20 posts regarding that outage on this particular group, it was a lot. The first couple, maybe 5 or 6, would come through and say, we got no power. I'd come back, log it. Others would come back, log it. And then we sit back and we wait. There might be a couple of updates that go through. There could have been a couple of videos in this case and photographs when the power cables were brought down, etc. And then after that, as you get into the 24, 30-hour period, are there any updates? Somebody's missed something. Have I missed something? So if there were 20 or 30 posts, it was a lot. But I want to tell you on the other groups, East Rand, Joburg South areas, and various other WhatsApp groups I've been monitoring, they go out and they've got like 50, 60, 70 messages for a 3-hour outage. Lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, lack of discipline, I don't know. There are so many factors that can come into play there. Maybe it's just the way the groups are managed. I'm not too sure. But there are a lot of factors which contribute to this. And ultimately, at the end of the day, people get upset with the amount of traffic, the amount of messages, and inevitably they exit the group and therefore do not benefit from the role that social media can play before, during and after a disaster. And at this moment in time, I'm still on the subject of before, not even during or after. So let's move on now with voice note number 7. Continuing the role of social media before, during, and after a disaster. This is voice note number 7, 20th of April 2024. Time is now 13:27. I've basically covered just briefly a couple of things with regards to sharing the content before a disaster on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And I think those of you that listened intently to what I said, that was before a disaster. Now let's look at what happens during a disaster. And this is where it becomes a lot more complex. Because during a disaster, if you've only had 5 people that have monitored what's going on your posts before, you might have 10% of the people now monitoring your posts. However, your social media content advisors for your local community, the NGOs that are operating in the area, that means that they are going to have to disseminate information on a more regular basis on Facebook and across probably multiple Facebook pages, because of the fact that you everybody now wants to be in charge, and you've got a Facebook group for the suburb. Then you've got another Facebook group for the same suburb. The one might have 2,000 people, the other might have 23,000. So now it becomes an issue for the social media management, if I can put it to you that way, because I've got to generalize across the board. You know, other organizations might have a social media controller or manager or whatever they want to term it, and then another organization has got them under different titles. So I don't want to bring it down to titles. Now they're going to have to go and post on Facebook page number 1, Facebook page number 2, etc., etc. And that's problematic, because it adds additional work before you can actually get any, sort of viable information out for the 10%. Then the same thing applies with Twitter. If you don't have a strong following, it doesn't make any sense. To give you an example, I don't know what the City Power following or the Eskom following is on the Twitter accounts. It would be interesting to go back and have a look at it. So as part of the overall conversation, instead of me giving it to you, why don't you, as the listener and the participant in this discussion, actually go and have a look at Twitter and get an idea of how many people follow those entities itself, and then look for other NGOs and see what their following looks like. And the same thing applies, of course, with Instagram and YouTube. Now, I have not brought up the issue of WhatsApp at this stage, and I don't wish to bring WhatsApp up until voice note number 8, and I want to cover WhatsApp across all 3 categories, because right now I think in the next minute I can close off the whole concept of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube after the disaster. There's no difference before, during, or after. All of the pros, which are very few, apply before, during, and after on those platforms. All of the cons also apply before, during, and after on all of those mentioned platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, during and after a disaster. And why do I in actual fact bring this up? Because at the end of the day, the instant messaging platforms, including Facebook Messenger, are probably more viable for use before, during, and after a disaster. Some of the statistics that were given, referencing back to the UNHCR document in particular, they discovered that probably a couple of years ago, I know the numbers have increased, WhatsApp had like a billion WhatsApp users per month, as opposed to Telegram, which only had 100 million users per month. And it just goes to show the actual imbalance between the various platforms. Where Telegram has got additional features and capabilities, WhatsApp still remains the number 1 platform to utilize, which now should in actual fact be and could be used for the benefit of communities, which I would like to start addressing in terms of voice note number 8. Now, with regards to voice note number 8, moving forward, I'm not going to concentrate on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Telegram, and all of the other platforms. Signal is another instant messaging platform as well. I want to focus in specifically on WhatsApp. WhatsApp being a billion users, several years ago on a monthly basis, just makes it far more viable to utilize with regards to how we integrate our communications, number 1, our dissemination, number 2, even our management and reporting processes following or before, during, and after a disaster itself. And I think by now everybody realizes that, yes, this is going to be one of the major platforms to utilize, having as many members as it does. But there's a couple of, the pros are quite simple. We can reach as a non-government organization as a community as a whole, we can reach a far larger audience utilizing WhatsApp. And I think that is the biggest and only pro that needs to be considered. Everything else follows that pro alone. However, we need to look at the cons of WhatsApp. We need to look at the cons with regards to administrators on WhatsApp. But like all other social media platforms, the very first thing I want to cover is that before a disaster, WhatsApp is available to the masses. What happens during a disaster? We don't, as a community, sort of tie up that during a disaster, an earthquake, a tornado, a major flood. For those of you that saw the videos of the flooding in Margate now, April of 2024, where roadways were ripped up due to the flood waters and the strength of that water, it must be clearly understood that fiber connection cables, electrical cables, water pipes were also ripped up in that process. That means that within a given area of the disaster, there might not have been WhatsApp communications. No fiber, no internet, no WhatsApp. The same thing applies with your cell phone towers for those of you that utilize the data aspect of your cell phone connectivity for WhatsApp and for web pages, etc. Those towers are being damaged in times of disaster. Therefore, there could be a problem that there is no communication capability usable via WhatsApp. And the entire communication process, assistance requesting process, dispatching process via WhatsApp, dissemination of information via WhatsApp falls flat. You're dead in the water, literally. That being said, if you are in an area where you are fortunate enough not to be affected by that communication capability fallout, there is another possibility that needs to be considered, and that is the lack of electrical power. Your cell phone will work for X amount of hours. How do you recharge your phone following a disaster? You will still find yourself in the same position whereby you have got zero communication capabilities during a disaster. Your WhatsApp is dead, your internet is dead, everything is dead. You cannot charge it. You may think to yourself, it's fine, I'll duck off to my daughter or my auntie or my uncle or my aunt. Wait, the roads are destroyed. You might not be able to travel. Yeah, but that's cool, I've got a solar system. Really? 12 hours of rain, gray skies, no sun, your solar system is dead. Yeah, that's fine. I can go on and I can use my generator. Average amount of petrol in a generator, maybe 8 hours after that, you're dead. Your disaster can affect your area for 2-3 days, if not weeks. Look at what happened in KZN. They today, 2.5-3 years later, are still sitting with infrastructure damages. Let's move on with voice note number 9. All right, so voice note number 9. I've just covered the pros, which is quite simple. Reach the masses. And the cons, multiple cons. No internet, no cell phone, no power, no charging, no nothing. And therefore, WhatsApp is dead. You can't do anything. Now, let's move on to post-disaster when it comes to social media. Now, post-disaster, well, after a couple of days, the authorities may be able to supply power, and you can charge your phone. or connect up the fiber internet connections that got ripped up, giving you internet access, or going out and replacing the antennas and getting in some mobile cell transmitters, and your cell phone connectivity is connected. But that's going to take a couple of days. Look at what happened in the Knysna fires, where the cell phone networks failed due to the fact that the towers were burnt during the fires in Knysna of 2017. The entire area had no communication capabilities, no cell phones, no nothing, no internet, no nothing through those networks. And due to the intensity of the fires, the cell providers and service providers couldn't go in and repair the equipment. It was declared too dangerous, and the fire and disaster management officials prevented them from entering those areas. So they were dead in the water for several days as well, as far as communications is concerned. Now, this just covers the general pros and cons. There's a couple of other things that I do want to cover with regards to the role that social media plays and what is required when we, in actual fact, utilize social media for our disaster-related and disaster risk reduction aspects. And upfront, I think this is now where I literally speak from the heart right across the board. Firstly, one needs to understand that disaster risk reduction is something that is generally carried out in terms of the disaster management cycle before a disaster occurs. In other words, this is where the community members and the authorities undertake specific assessments of an area. They determine risk levels with regards to certain perils. They document this and they plan and prepare for the potential of a disaster occurring in terms of that peril itself. Again, this is where disaster relief cert volunteers registered with us. One of your prime requirements during your initial stages of becoming a disaster relief cert registered volunteer would be, there's a requirement for you to undertake the disaster area damage assessment training in order to go out and do just such an assessment and to properly document it, so that we can move that up to the disaster management levels for consideration moving forward. So disaster risk reduction is the before factor. However, during a disaster, again, your disaster relief cert registered volunteers will then be able to go out and do preliminary assessments of the area and report that information back up through the structures to disaster management centers. And the purpose for that is there's nothing worse. Myself, having worked on it with the Fries ambulance for several years, there's nothing worse than being dispatched while even, running the response vehicles in AMBOs when I was with SA Red Cross. There was nothing worse than being dispatched to a call or being notified of an incident, and then you run the quickest route that you know, only to find that the traffic is gridlocked or the roads are damaged or whatever the case might be, and you got to divert and get yourself out of that situation, or just stand down completely because you can't get out. And of course, you can't get to your patients, you can't get to the people who are in need. So the disaster relief cert volunteers will be able to provide that information before the vehicle is dispatched, and the dispatchers would then be able to say, avoid route A, B, C, D. Today's times, a lot of this is also done via traffic reports and advisories that you put out on social media. So just bear that in mind as I move into voice note number 10.